The diner lights buzzed softly beneath the weight of midnight silence. A weary waitress moved from table to table, unaware that fate was about to test her resolve. When a tattooed stranger's hand tore at her shirt, the room erupted in laughter until silence struck again. He hadn't realized who else was watching. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your comments, gifts, and memberships allow us to bring more heartfelt stories to life. Maya Tuner worked the late shift at Rusty's Diner, a lonely roadside stop just outside Denver. At 26, she bore years that weighed far heavier than her age. Her father's debts had devoured her dreams, chaining her to endless double shifts and sleepless nights. Still, she greeted strangers with a smile, even when her hands trembled from exhaustion. Most of her customers were truckers and locals who knew her kindness. They tipped what they could. Never enough to lighten her burdens, but always enough to remind her she was seen. That night, the neon lights flickered faintly against the storm outside. Rain streaked the windows in crooked lines. Maya leaned against the counter, tying back her hair, trying to shake off the heaviness of another endless evening. What she didn't realize was that, in the far corner, a group of Hell's Angels sat quietly eating, their laughter subdued. They hadn't come for trouble. They hadn't come to draw attention. But life had a way of forcing hidden guardians into the open. The door swung wide with the hiss of rain. A man stepped inside. Derek, mid-30s, broad-shouldered, tattoos coiled up his arms like barbed wire. His presence shifted the room instantly. Maya felt it at once, though she forced her smile to remain steady. He carried an energy that was not just heavy, but sharp, impatient, and reckless. His boots scraped across the floor as he dragged himself to the counter. "Coffee?" he barked, tossing a crumpled bill as though it were a weapon. Maya nodded, pouring the dark liquid with gentle care and setting it before him with quiet grace. Derek smirked, his eyes crawling over her like she was just another possession waiting to be claimed. From the corner, one of the bikers lifted his head, sensing the shift. But for now, silence held. Maya had dealt with men like Derek before. Some were lonely, some were broken. But this one, he seemed to revel in the storm he carried, as though others existed only to drown in it. She turned to refill the pot when Derek's voice cut through the air again. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What's a girl like you doing wasting her life in a dump like this?" She forced a polite smile and answered softly, "Just working hard. Everyone's got to eat." But his smirk widened, turning crueler. "Or maybe you just enjoy men staring at you while you serve pie and coffee. Is that it?" The diner stiffened. A few locals shifted uncomfortably, their eyes dropping to avoid his. Maya's heart pounded, but she refused to flinch. She had learned how to hold on to her dignity in moments like this, even when her insides trembled. Derek leaned in closer, whispering something only she could hear. Words she never repeated, but her face betrayed the wound they left behind. She stepped back, swallowing hard. The Hell's Angels exchanged glances in silence. Their leader, Mason, narrowed his eyes, but remained still. For now, Maya had chosen silence, and they respected that. But the night was far from finished. Her shift dragged on as rain battered the glass and thunder rolled in the distance. The bikers stayed quiet, their presence nearly invisible. Derek began pressing harder. He slammed his mug onto the counter. "Cough. Fee's cold. You useless or just stupid." The insult stung, but Maya simply reached for the pot. She refilled his cup and murmured, "Sorry about that." Derek laughed, the sound sharp as glass. "Sorry? You think sorry fixes being pathetic?" The room tensed. A trucker in the back started to rise, but Mason's subtle shake of his head kept him seated. Mason's eyes never left Derek, his patience steady. He knew tempers flared brightest right before they burned out. Maya fixed her gaze on the counter, forcing back tears. She wasn't weak, she refused to be. But nights like this stripped her raw until she felt as fragile as glass about to shatter, and Derek seemed to delight in pushing harder against those cracks. Past midnight, the diner settled into a strained quiet. Derek's mockery slowed, but his gaze still stalked Maya, cruel and hungry. She gathered plates, moving to clear a booth nearby. Her sleeve slipped back, exposing a faint scar along her arm. Derek spotted it, his smile twisting darker. "Looks like you've had men teach you lessons before," he sneered. The word struck like a slap, freezing her mid-step. A weight of shame she'd never chosen to carry dragged at her. Still, she straightened, whispered, "Please don't," and turned away. But Derek wasn't done. His hand shot out, gripping her wrist with rough force. Gasps rippled through the room. Plates rattled in her trembling hands. Maya tore free, whispering again, "Please stop." Mason's chair creaked as he leaned forward. His men's eyes sharpened like blades. Outside, the storm howled louder, as though the world itself sensed the tension. This was the moment Derek should have released her. Instead, he chose violence. In one reckless motion, Derek yanked at Maya's shirt. The thin fabric split along the seam. Gasps erupted across the diner. Shock, anger, disbelief. Maya froze, humiliation burning through her like fire. Her hands clutched desperately at the torn fabric across her chest. Tears blurred her vision. For an instant, she felt completely exposed, stripped not only of her shirt, but of her dignity. Derek laughed, his voice jagged and cruel. "Now that's more like it." But his laughter died quickly. The scrape of a chair across the floor silenced the diner. Mason stood, his broad frame cutting a shadow through the neon glow. The leather cut on his back carried a symbol no one could mistake. The Hell's Angels. Derek's grin faltered. His eyes darted to the men now rising behind Mason. Their presence was thunder-given flesh. Maya's chest heaved, but for the first time that night, she wasn't trembling alone. The air had shifted, the wolves had risen, and the predator was no longer the strongest animal here. Mason. He didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, his heavy boots striking the tile as he moved toward the counter. The rest of the bikers rose behind him, silent, united. Their leather cuts bore the red and white emblem that commanded respect in every corner of America. Derek's swagger faltered. His laugh broke under the crushing weight pressing in from all sides. He hadn't realized who he was taunting, who he had chosen to humiliate in front of. Maya clutched at her torn shirt, her breathing sharp and uneven. She could feel the eyes on her again, but this time, they weren't mocking. They were protective, unyielding. Mason stopped just a few feet from Derek. His voice was calm, steady, yet edged with steel. "Put your hands down." The diner sank into complete silence. Even the rain outside seemed to freeze in the air. Derek swallowed hard, forcing a crooked grin. "Relax, old man. I was just playing around." Mason's jaw tightened. His men stood still, their presence like thunder waiting for lightning. Playtime's over. Derek tried to laugh, but the sound was thin and empty. He looked around the diner, desperate for an ally, but found none. Every pair of eyes burned with disgust. Maya's trembling whisper broke the silence. "Please, just stop." But Derek wasn't ready to yield. His pride, wounded by the challenge, drove him toward recklessness. He puffed out his chest, leaning closer to Mason with a sneer. "Think that jacket makes you king? This is between me and her. Stay out of it." Mason tilted his head slightly, his gaze never wavering from Derek. His composure was more terrifying than rage. "It stopped being just between you and her the moment you tore her shirt," he said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut glass. Derek scoffed, though his hands shook faintly against the counter. He hadn't anticipated pushback, certainly not from men who carried the kind of weight Mason and his crew did. Outside, lightning split the storm wide open. Inside, another storm was moments from breaking. Maya stepped back, torn between fear and a strange sense of protection. She had spent years convinced no one would ever defend her, that her battles were hers alone. Yet now, strangers stood like walls between her and harm. Derek masked his unease with bravado, leaning back and spreading his arms. "What? You gonna hit me in front of everyone?" Mason didn't flinch. He took one slow step forward, the air thickening with unspoken menace. "This isn't about hitting you," Mason said evenly. "It's about teaching you respect." The weight of those words struck harder than any fist. Derek's smirk faltered. His eyes darted to the door, to the bikers flanking Mason, then back to Maya still clutching her shirt. For the first time that night, Derek saw himself reflected not as a predator, but as a coward, cornered by his own cruelty. Whether he would accept that truth or ignite chaos was yet uncertain. The tension snapped when Derek suddenly shoved his chair back. The legs screeching against the floor. He rose, towering but trembling. "Back off," he barked, though his voice betrayed a quiver. "I don't take orders from bikers." Mason's men remained statues carved from loyalty. Mason's narrowed eyes, his stillness itself, carried more threat than motion. More dangerous than a shout. Mason's words landed with quiet weight. "You don't take orders from bikers," he said evenly. "But tonight, you'll take one from me. Apologize to her." Derek forced a nervous laugh, his gaze flickering once more toward Maya. "She doesn't need me to apologize. She enjoyed the attention." The words hung in the air like poison. Gasps rippled across the diner. Fresh tears welled in Maya's eyes, not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of carrying cruelty in silence for too long. Mason's jaw tightened. He had given Derek a chance, and Derek had squandered it. The entire room braced itself, knowing what came next. When patience ends, consequences begin. Mason moved without hesitation, not violently, but with commanding force. His palm slammed against the counter beside Derek's cup, the sharp crack echoing like a gunshot. Derek recoiled, stumbling backward in shock. Mason leaned forward, his voice dropping low and dangerous. "You don't get to humiliate women in my presence. Not her. Not ever." The diner seemed to hold its breath. Derek's face burned crimson, torn between arrogance and fear. He opened his mouth to lash back, but Mason's hand pressed firmly against his chest, not striking, only pinning him with sheer authority. "Look around," Mason said, nodding at the room. "Not a single person here respects you. You think power comes from tearing people down. That isn't power, it's weakness." Derek's fists clenched, but his courage was unraveling. He glanced toward the other bikers, silent, immovable figures, and realized the odds were stacked against him. For the first time, his smirk disappeared completely. Maya stood frozen, her breath unsteady. In Mason's words, she felt something she hadn't in years: protection. Derek spat one last attempt at defiance, his voice dripping venom. "You think you're some savior? She's just a waitress. Who cares?" Maya's heart sank at the cruelty, but Mason didn't waver. His eyes burned with restrained fury. "That just a waitress works harder than you'll ever dream. She shows up day after day carrying burdens you wouldn't survive for a week, and you treat her like garbage. That ends tonight." The entire diner seemed to lean closer at his words. From the corner, the trucker gave a subtle nod of agreement. Even strangers felt the undeniable truth in Mason's voice. Cornered and stripped of his false bravado, Derek lowered his eyes for the first time. "Say it," Mason commanded. "Say you're sorry." Pride strangled Derek's throat, but the weight of the room pressed harder than any fist. At last, through gritted teeth, he muttered, "Sorry." It wasn't enough. Not yet. Mason shook his head slowly, his tone calm but razor sharp. "Not to me. To her." The silence thickened, heavy and suffocating. Derek turned his head toward Maya, humiliation twisting his features. "I'm sorry," he forced out, his voice bitter but audible. Maya's lips trembled. For years, she had suffered through insults, groping hands, and cruel laughter, with no one ever demanding respect on her behalf. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she lifted her chin, determined not to let Derek witness her break. Mason stepped back a fraction, granting Derek space, but not freedom. His towering frame made sure of that. "Now leave," Mason ordered, his voice flat. Derek faltered, then yanked his jacket off the stool, his gaze flicking nervously around the room. But the faces staring back weren't fearful, they were firm, unshaken. He shoved through the door into the storm, the bell, above it clanging like a gavel sealing his fate. Inside, silence lingered, but this time it felt lighter. Maya stood rooted in place, one hand clutching her torn shirt. The adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, her heart pounding against her ribs like a relentless drum. Mason turned to her, his tone softening. "You okay?" Maya nodded quickly, though tears streamed down her cheeks. I think so." One of Mason's men slipped off his leather jacket and draped it gently over her shoulders. Its heavy warmth wrapped around her like a shield, making her feel safe for the first time all night. She drew in a deep breath. "You didn't have to," she began, but Mason stopped her with a shake of his head. "No woman should have to fight that kind of battle alone." The words struck her like sunlight piercing storm clouds. She had never expected protection from strangers, least of all from men with the fearsome reputation of the Hell's Angels. But in this moment, they weren't outlaws. They were guardians, and for Maya, that meant everything. The diner slowly came back to life. Plates clattered, forks scraped, soft conversations rose again. Yet the air carried something new, respect, and it wasn't directed at Mason and his crew, it was directed at Maya. The trucker, who had almost stepped in, tipped his hat toward her, a quiet gesture of solidarity. A young couple in a booth smiled at her with subtle admiration. Maya drew the jacket tighter, feeling its weight not as a burden, but as armor. She glanced at Mason. His expression was calm, his eyes steady, yet kind. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mason gave a single nod. "Just keep standing tall. That's all the thanks we need." For years, Maya had believed strength meant enduring silently. Tonight, she learned that strength also meant accepting help when it came, and that sometimes it arrived from the most unlikely places, even leather-clad riders the world feared. As the rain eased outside, the bikers returned to their booth. Mason lifted his coffee cup toward Maya in a silent toast, a gesture of respect rather than authority. She managed a faint smile and returned to her work. But this time, her steps carried dignity instead of defeat. She caught her reflection in the window, and for the first time in years, she didn't see a fragile woman staring back. She no longer saw herself as just a girl trying to survive. She saw a woman who had been tested, humiliated, yet remained standing because others refused to let her fall. Her scarred arm no longer felt like a flaw. Tonight, it stood as proof of everything she had endured. Maya poured coffee for a nearby table, her voice steadier now. Customers met her with something unfamiliar in their eyes. It wasn't pity, it wasn't dismissal, it was genuine respect. Derek had tried to rob her of her dignity. Instead, his cruelty had revealed it, and that was the justice Mason had promised. When her shift finally ended, Maya lingered by the door. The storm had softened into a drizzle, the air carrying the fresh scent of rain on pavement. Mason and his crew were getting ready to leave, leather jackets creaking as they lifted helmets in hand. Before stepping outside, Mason stopped beside her. "You keep fighting, Maya," he said softly. "You've got more strength than you realize." Her eyes shimmered. "I don't feel strong." Mason gave a faint smile, the kind that belonged to someone who had fought too many battles. "That's because strength doesn't always feel like strength. Most of the time, it feels like surviving. And you've been doing that your whole life, May." His throat tightened. She longed to say more, but words deserted her. Instead, she nodded, pulling his jacket tighter around her shoulders. With a final nod, Mason and his men disappeared into the night, their engines roaring like thunder as they faded into the distance. Maya remained in the doorway, still wrapped in the weight of their protection. By morning, she returned to the diner for another shift. Her torn shirt had been replaced, but the memory of the night lingered like smoke. She braced for whispers, for judgment. Instead, she found warmth. Customers greeted her with gentle smiles, subtle nods of respect. The young couple from the booth returned, leaving behind a generous tip with a message scrawled on a napkin. "You're stronger than you know." Maya folded the note carefully, tucking it into her pocket like a hidden piece of armor. The diner felt different now, no longer just a place of work, but a place where her dignity had been defended and restored. Even though Mason and his crew were gone, their presence lingered, as if the walls themselves remembered the stand they had taken for her. Maya realized something profound. Angels didn't always have wings. Sometimes they wore leather and rode motorcycles. That night, after her shift, Maya walked home through quiet streets. The rain had stopped, and the moon glowed above, watching like a witness to her transformation. She replayed Mason's words in her mind. Strength doesn't always feel like strength. For the first time, she let herself believe it. Every scar, every burden, every tear she carried wasn't weakness, it was survival. At her apartment door, she paused. The night's silence wrapped around her. A faint smile touched her lips. A man had tried to strip away her dignity, but strangers had shown her she was worth defending. That truth would outlast every scar. She turned the key, stepping into her modest home, but her heart carried something new. Hope. Hope that even in a world shadowed by cruelty, kindness and protection could rise from the most unexpected places. Weeks later, Maya still worked long hours at Rusty's diner. Life hadn't magically changed. The bills still came, the exhaustion still pressed heavy. But inside, something was different. She no longer lowered her gaze when mocked. She no longer believed she was invisible. Whenever fear crept in, she remembered that night, the jacket over her shoulders, the voice that told her she was stronger than she knew. She carried that truth like armor. Maya accepted she couldn't stop the storms from coming, but she could stand taller through every one. As she poured coffee for another weary traveler, she caught her reflection in the window again. This time, she didn't just see herself. She saw every woman who had ever been underestimated, humiliated, or silenced, still standing, still unbroken. And for the first time, Maya smiled at the reflection staring back. Maya Tuner's story reminds us that dignity is never weakness, and strength often rises quietly until someone finally sees it. Sometimes protectors arrive when we least expect them. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and press the bell icon so more people can find the courage to stand.